Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, all of the crypto nerds out there in the crypto nerd land. Guess what? You know who I am. I'm the real Monty Allen, and I am your crypto nerd.
And I'm Lauren Wixom, and I am your crypto queen.
Well, hello. So we are here today with Sinjin from ARC. And I almost want to say ARC coin, but that would be a little bit redundant, wouldn't it? So we're going to talk about ARC here in just a few minutes, talk about what it is, the background, the history. Before we do that, though, Sinjin, could you give us a brief history of yourself, and then we'll dive into the project?
Sure. Myself, I'm South Korean. I was educated in the U.S. and Canada, and worked for the Korean government as a technology negotiator, and then PricewaterhouseCoopers as a regulatory consultant, strategy side. And I guess my big claim to fame is that I ended up in the poker industry and was the regional director of a company called PokerStars in Asia, and I legalized poker in Macau. Worked with all the big casinos there for a few years. Was there really when, it was really just driving in terms of growth and so on and so forth. And then I went off on my own, stopped being an executive, went the entrepreneurial route, got hammered for 4 years, very much so. Eventually ended up setting up a fintech company in the Philippines, which had a national e-money license, like an internet banking license. And we sold that to, at the time, it was called Ant Financial, Alibaba's kind of financial arm, Alipay, as well as CP Group. It was a consortium at the time. I think a lot of your viewers may not know. They may know Alibaba, but they may not know CP Group. But CP Group is the largest conglomerate in Thailand. They're about 30% bigger than Samsung. So. Wow. Yeah, two major groups had bought us out. It was a good acquisition, and then that was in early 2017. And then by that time, I had decided I was going to take some time off because I had been burning the candle at both ends as an executive and as an entrepreneur for many years. Mm-hmm. But then I fell down the rabbit hole with Bitcoin and Ethereum and blockchain, and I guess the rest is kind of history.
Yeah, so it sounds like 217 was also the kind of your introduction to the whole crypto verse. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I mean, when you're in online gaming and gaming in general, you're always looking at whatever payment solutions are out there. And so I was aware of Bitcoin maybe a few months after it had actually launched. And I can remember thinking that as long as it had value, I didn't really care about like what the kind of structure was there behind it. But I actually tried to mine Bitcoin back in like 2011, and I couldn't figure it out. Right? Like I couldn't figure it out.
That was early.
Yeah. So, but 2012, I was involved with a couple of Bitcoin projects, but there was the Mt. Gox, and Bitcoin had hit like 1,000, and then it had dropped to 400, and then eventually like 200 or so. And then I just kind of like stepped away from it as I was kind of quote unquote real life, really approaching my own fintech projects and trying to get those off and running. And then in 2017, I ended up getting a call from a friend of mine, and he was a forex trader, and he said to me, "Can you give me some advice? There's this mid-sized investment bank in Hong Kong that wants to open a crypto desk." And when I say mid-sized in Hong Kong, I mean like this is pretty big, right?
Yeah.
These are like billions of dollars under assets under management. And I'm like, why would a mid-sized Hong Kong bank want to open a crypto desk? This is 2017. And then he kind of just let me know what was going on with Ethereum and so on and so forth. And I dived in, and then that's when I really went down the rabbit hole. And then I ended up meeting some people, some real OGs in the Bitcoin space through my friend. And, I sat back down with the white paper, Satoshi's white paper, and I reread it like 30 times. And then I finally kind of was like, wow, okay, this is something real.
It sunk in then at that point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. Just took 30 times.
That's all it took.
Yeah.
I find that many of us have gone through this kind of roller coaster of experiences, right? From early stages for you, and then setting it aside and realizing, okay, this may not be worth it yet, and then coming back to it again in 2017. Mount Gox scared off I don't know how many people early days, and then to come back to it. Is a story that I've heard, many times over again. And then after 2017, right, crypto winter, so to speak, for many years, kind of scared off another batch of folks. And then each time, though, it seems like it's like the phoenix. It just kind of keeps rising back up again because the idea behind, not just cryptocurrency, but blockchain usage in general. Is very, very appealing. That leveling of the playing field, so to speak. And I think that's kind of a good place to start. So for you transitioned from a background that had nothing to do with monetary reserve. So you're talking about poker and transitioning from that to something like this, where you're really trying to level the playing field on multiple aspects.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about that transition and what got you there?
Well, I had studied like political theory and international relations in my undergraduate, and then I'd actually studied my master's in divinity theology, and so I've always been drawn to kind of like the bigger issues, the bigger questions. And when it was time for me to kind of get married and to stop playing rugby. I had played rugby all through university and so on and so forth. Then I was like, okay, well, I've tried to like look at these kind of very big, broad questions, and the end result is I need to get married. I need a legitimate job, and I'm not going to play rugby forever. And I had ended up doing my MBA, and it was very interesting that in Korea, when you do your MBA, as I don't know if some of your viewers know, I mean, you have Samsung and LG and huge companies right now. But after World War II, we were pretty much a pre-industrialized country, even though we've been around for literally a couple of thousand years. We were just not industrialized, and so for everyone who takes any business courses, or if you're South Korean, you ended up learning about this history about our own economic development having gone from basically non-industrialized to industrialized and urbanized in 30 years. Yeah. And no other country has been able to replicate or sustain that kind of growth like South Korea has. And so economic development has always kind of been there from the start of my education, and it's something obviously that it's a massive complex issue. But as I went into business and and being that Generation X where I was starting high school, and the Berlin Wall fell, and we saw the end of the Cold War, this kind of issue of whether it's ideological concerns or like global kind of equality, it kind of went out the window, and it was just like, capitalism's correct. Let's just make as much money as we can, and progress will lead the way, and everyone will be better, because once they're consumers, they won't want to fight either as well. Yeah. But when I was obviously in the throes of the casino industry, I was actually hired from Price Waterhouse by PokerStars originally, because I was more on the regulatory strategic side. And so when they had come into Asia, there was no real framework for online gaming or gaming in general outside these very few centers, which was really Macau and Singapore had yet to really open at that point. They had just announced the bids back in like 2005 to open up these two massive casinos. Mm-hmm. And so it was kind of a wide open thing. And then throughout this time of seeing all this hyper growth, huge infrastructure being built around the casinos and so on and so forth, if you go to a place like Philippines, there you have like, seriously, the people there are richer than the 1% here in New York, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's how wealthy they are. I have like open air villas that like span a block in size, right? City block in size. And the wealth is just humongous. But like on maybe like half a mile away, you'll see people with literally dirt floors living in shanty towns. And that kind of imagery, as well as having my own staff there and my dev team and so on and so forth, and seeing that kind of disparity, it just bothered me like so much. But it was like something like there was nothing actually I could really think to do, because on a structural level, I didn't think there were any solutions. So fast forward to like 2017, I'm like, reading about blockchain and getting into it, and I realized that for the first time in human history, a decentralized network is possible. Why it wasn't possible before is we didn't have like the technological rails for it, but with blockchain, that it was possible. And so if you could actually empower individuals now, and then they could coordinate through their own incentives without having someone to decide when they got something, then suddenly, there was a way to directly access and create like their own structure, independent of having to, go into the centralized structure and try to change things. I mean, a lot of times people say, if you don't like the institution, go in and reform it, right? But if you're one person against an institution that's 200 years old, it's never going to happen. I don't care if you're Barack Obama or whatever, it's just not going to happen. Yeah, the inertia's there. But if you could create your own system, but it's on the same level playing field, like let's say there's a massive bank, okay, and then you're going to create your own community bank. Well, that massive bank has resources to crush you. But if you're decentralized, right, and everyone's on the same page and everyone's able to coordinate in the same way, and even if they crush little bits of you here and there, you're able to continually create your own structure. Well, that is super robust, right? And it's distributed right at the beginning of the creation of the network itself as well. So it's not like later on you have to decide whether or not we're going to get participants or whether or not we're going to open this up. It doesn't work unless it's open, right? And as soon as I got that, I was like, okay, let me think of the biggest thing that you could do with this application, me being a strategist and ex-theologian or whatever like that. And, I came to, ARCC, the Asia Reserve Currency coin, and I thought, what Southeast Asia needs is a lot of like social transparency, but they also need something like the euro, where you have this, you have very different economies in the region, but yet they could benefit so much so from having some kind of single monetary, not policy, but at least like umbrella. So then, 2017, I'm like, okay, well then, I haven't studied economic development for I don't know, 15, 20 years. So
you just dive back in.
Yeah. So I ended up applying to Harvard Kennedy School, and I ended up spending about 2 years there, taking these intensive executive courses, and I ended up getting my executive public policy certificate from the Harvard Kennedy School. So I knew that I would be up to date and be able to speak about these things. So I think a lot of people, they get into tokenomics or monetary policy, but you never had to do this. Like I'm like a C-level international multi-level consultant executive, and if you had to say like advise on this monetary policy of this government, that never ever comes up.
That wasn't in your wheelhouse, huh?
It's not in anyone's wheelhouse. Even if you're in the UN or whatever like that, the IMF. I mean, how many times does a country start a new currency? I mean, there are. Yeah, I mean, it happens in Africa. Every time there's a new regime change or whatever like that. But they're not really listening to the IMF or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I went back to school as a Gen Xer. Things like I should go and learn from people that really know this stuff, and then come back to it, which presented its own interesting difficulties in that the trajectory of where crypto has gone has been these very ambitious 20-year-olds who have grown up and have been disenfranchised by this financial system and been involved in social media and the internet for their entire lives. And so for them, Googling what is monetary policy and seeing an application that works and then putting into action and it kind of working is good enough for them to start, right? Whereas for me, it's like if I don't kind of see the entire picture, then I I feel like fake. I don't want to start. I think I'm just bullshitting people, right? But it's a different mentality, and so I really did feel where I'm in my mid 40s that there was this kind of generational gap in this particular. I don't even think that like I wouldn't qualify myself as OG in this field. I think people think I'm like wise grandpa in the room here. What is he talking about, right? Yeah.
I understand completely where you're coming from. So you and I are in a similar age bracket. So I'm also in my mid to late 40s, and it was a kind of thing for me where we weren't digitally native, so to speak. So we didn't grow up that way. So I had to do some similar things to you. I went and got some books. I had to. Right, Lauren's laughing at us. She's like, okay, boomers. Right. And then I realized, okay, well, there's not a lot of information out there for someone like me to digest. If somebody does go Google it, so I try to get some information out there, and that's really how I started with the the YouTube channel in the first place. Was trying to get some information that was digestible by other people like me who did have some liquid assets or the ability to make some investments, and were wondering like, hey, should I dabble in this area? And even though I'm not an investment advisor by any means, I've got an MBA and I've got a business background, but I wanted to get that perspective out there from just fundamentals and that sort of thing. It's interesting, but I applaud you for going back and recognizing that here's what I don't know, and I need to gather that knowledge. And I think that takes some courage to figure out, okay, how do I start over and get this right so I don't mess it up?
Yeah, if I could start all over again, I would have just surrounded myself or embedded myself with a whole bunch of of these. Actually, I did try to do that. I was at MIT from like 2017 to 2019 as I was studying in Boston, and we had actually sponsored one of the Bitcoin expos back in like 2017 or 2018. Actually, ARCC. We just had our white paper, and it was like version 2 or something like that, and it was super awkward, right? And I just, I think like they didn't know what to make of me, and I was trying to fit in. And again, me fitting in is like terrible. Like I'm a pretty, outgoing guy, and me trying to fit in just obviously was very off-putting, because obviously I wasn't really being myself, and they didn't know what to make of me. And the priorities that I had and the priorities that they had were very different. I was trying to get answers for the priorities that I had. Meanwhile, for them, it was all about the excitement, the experimentation, so on and so forth. And I was saying, well, what is this? What happens in 10, 15 years from now? And they go, everything's decentralized. Right? Everything's a DAO. I'm like, okay, I get that, but how do we kind of get there? And that misconnect, I wish that I had, instead during that time, just shut up, not had an agenda, and just listened, and just sat there and just listened without an agenda. But I also had like this very pressing desire, that I had this eureka moment where I thought the biggest problem that has always been there in my eyes has been, how do you solve this kind of wealth inequality when it's not based on a matter of merit, but a matter of injustice, right? And it was enough that, it was enough that instead of kind of taking the time off to take care of my health and kind of get back into shape and take care of my kids and my wife, who I've been neglecting for most of my marriage as I've been traveling and so on and so forth, I decided to dive back in. And I think my wife was kind of like, all right, like I thought, we're going to have some more time together. And I said, I'll try what I can do, which was a total lie, because then I ended up going to Boston for 2 years. But, thank God we had the pandemic, in the sense that the silver lining I can say here is that I was, I finally became a father and a somewhat competent husband for the last year and a half or so. Yeah.
I understand completely. I'm a bit of a workaholic myself, and during the pandemic, I worked from home, and so I was just I had more presence, I guess.
Absolutely.
Lauren's looking at us like I think she's got fuzzy babies, so that's about it right now.
That's it. Yeah.
The introduction in 2017 was very much at the time. not about anarchy, I guess, but it was very anti-government. Everything was anonymous. We need to get the government out of everything. I don't know necessarily that that was Satoshi's ultimate goal with producing that white paper. It was definitely to free. It gives some economic freedom, I think, and that was very admirable, and it was sort of co-opted, I think, by a lot of folks still to this day who are very, anti-government and very, hey, everything needs to be anonymous and decentralize everything, right? Which is interesting, specifically given, your role now in in a reserve capacity. We should probably touch on that a little bit and talk about the overall group and then ARC. And then there's some misconceptions that are out there that I definitely want to get on the table, about maybe the comparisons to Libra and social proof of work and those types of things.
Sure.
But let's talk about the overall organization just briefly. How does the reserve work? What is it? And how does it? How did it come into being?
Okay, so so I'm sitting at my kitchen table and I'm just really diving into Bitcoin and everything else like that. And I think, what is the biggest application that this could work for? And then I thought economic development of these failing corrupt states. And I'm like, great, okay, so you're going to do a reserve currency for the entire region. What's the issuing body? And I thought, where's the most pompous, biggest name that I could just cover it all with? And then I thought, okay, International Blockchain Monetary Reserve, obviously a play off the IMF, but kind of a middle finger to the IMF as well. It's I think in my Twitter handle I said that think the crypto IMF. If people don't know what the IMF is, International Monetary Fund, it was created after World War II as an institution to support other institutions creating financial markets and stability around the world after World War II, right? Which
the world's bailout kind of system.
Bailout system, but also like consultants is also a matter of giving kind of support to these new currencies and new economies where at the end of the day, and they knew that back then, it's like if you didn't have confidence in the economy, no one's going to invest, no one's going to allow you to have credit or grow. And so that's what it provided, but it was completely top down, right? It was directly with the governments, and they would come in obviously when there was something bad that was happening, and then they'd be in a very good negotiating power, and they could recommend austerity, it could recommend this transparency, break up these companies, so on and so forth. But you look at where the IMF or the UN and the World Bank have been very active. They've been continually active in certain countries, like developing countries like the Philippines or Indonesia or so on and so forth. But the standard of living for these countries in the bottom half, right, or even the bottom 80%, hasn't really improved over the last decades. In fact, like Philippines was one of the leading economies in Asia back in the 1970s. It was 5 times the size of South Korea's economy in the 1970s. So if you want to learn something in Asia, you would send your best and brightest to 2 places, either the United States or to the Philippines, right, to learn. They have the Asian Institute of Management in the Philippines, which at a certain point of time back in the 70s was the number one institution training the top CEOs from India, but you wouldn't think about that right now, right? But that entire region in the last 10 years has grown 66% overall. But, again, in terms of decreasing the amount of or increasing the amount of, I guess, middle class, it's been like negligible. In fact, in some cases, reversed. But IBMR was created so that we could have this umbrella and we could start projects. And the most important project we wanted to do, obviously, that kind of linchpins everything, was to first start with, the Southeast Asia region with ARCC, the Asia Currency Reserve coin, currency coin. And basically how the reserve works was fundamentally the way that all like foreign currencies reserves work. So if you're from America, it's really hard to understand this, but because America is the reserve currency for the world, meaning that like the United States doesn't need to hold other currencies because it is the main currency which everyone else holds, right? But there's a time in the 1997, sorry, it's called the Asian monetary crisis, where there was this overinvestment in Southeast Asia because the gains were terrific, right? And then there was some rumblings here and there, and people were realizing, hey, maybe these loans are a little bit out of control, so on and so forth. And then suddenly the Thai baht in about a week drops like 50%. Okay, it causes this cascading where the Korean won ends up dropping like 50%. The Indonesian currency, Malaysian ringgit, whatever like that, drop like 50, 60, 70, 80%. All this happening within a span of like 3 weeks. Like the entire financial global monetary system was literally on the verge of collapse. My professor, who was a visiting professor at Korean University, who was one of the lead strategist negotiators for that in the IMF, basically said, he said that they literally were on the phone for 4 or 5 days straight because they really believed that how interconnected the economies were, especially when South Korea got involved, that if the South Korean economy collapsed at that point, it would collapse the entire monetary system post World War II, right?
Like a domino.
Yeah, like a domino. And so what ends up happening is that why that happens is because as your domestic currency falls and you've taken out loans in your domestic currency, but you have to pay back in US dollars, suddenly you can't really pay back those foreign loans to foreign companies or to whatever in US dollars, because now your currency is worth like 50% less. So yeah, exactly. So what ends up happening with currencies is really interesting is that for IBMR, our theory is that currencies reflect the productivity of the economy. So when the world is happy and stable and they're buying lots of useless stuff, Japan and Korea's currency appreciates because all the Americans love to buy Korean handphones and Japanese, electronics and so on and so forth, right? So the demand gets stronger. But when the world's going to crap, then the U.S. dollar goes up and everyone else kind of goes down as they kind of seek safety, right? So what ends up happening is that pre-1997, South Korea's economy and everything else like that is shooting up. The Korean won is inflating, but there's nothing really backing that in the case of a fall. So long story short is that post 1997, every single East Asian country and most developing countries that are engaged in global trade, they hold vast sums of US dollars in case that there should be a currency attack or someone should short the currency or there should be a downturn, that the internal companies or the domestic companies can borrow from the government these US dollars at a better rate to pay back international loans rather than them being like everything being imploded. So a country that actually came out unscathed during 1997 was Hong Kong. And the Hong Kong government basically came through as like, if you fuckers want to fuck with Hong Kong, we are going to throw the kitchen sink at you guys, right? You are not going to short, you're not going to break this U.S. Hong Kong peg, which is it was like 7.8, right, conversion rate. And literally, like they bought companies up, and they sold off assets. They did everything they could to weather the storm, but they had enough resources to do that. So first and foremost, what a reserve is that you're holding various baskets of currencies, which you think that, depending on the scenario, will hold its value, right? And so the very basic thing is that we try to create an investment crypto reserve that before we really launched ARCC, we would have at least a base to say, look, the currency can't go under this. But that's not enough, because having assets is not enough. These assets have to work, or you need some kind of competitive, productive way to create cash flow or inflow into this kind of fund, right? So governments are not like governments that are supporting their own currency because they just have lots of US dollars, right? It's because they're doing something, and then the something that we wanted to do was on this process called social proof of work, right? And I guess at the time you have to understand that proof of work was the biggest monkey out there, right? Yeah. And so we did a play on that, which was basically, in our theory, the reason why a lot of failing emerging markets stay failing isn't because of funding. It's because of the distribution of capital, as well as the corruption that essentially governments were skimming off the top, and if they were not investing in public infrastructure, no one could kind of get ahead. And I'll give you an example here, specifically for the Philippines, is that there's two ways to get the highway. The Skyway, it's literally called the Skyway, and like the non-Skyway, okay? The Skyway, you pay a toll for about, like, I don't know, $1 or whatever like that. And you get to the airport. I'm not kidding, like in less than 15 minutes, okay? Mm-hmm. If you don't pay this toll, you could take an hour and a half to get to the airport from the same location. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, the reason why the Skyway was created, because it actually doesn't connect one terminal to the other terminal. It does that, but it connects one casino to another casino. And so the casinos basically politically, gave the, support for this to happen. But before the Skyway was open, right, before the casinos came into the Philippines, I was there, working and so on and so forth, and I saw this happen. There would always be traffic on this one particular long stretch between the terminals. And I asked the taxi driver, it must have been my fifth trip there, and I said, why is there always traffic here? And he starts laughing. He says, listen, kid, I've been driving this road. Well, he doesn't say kid, he says sir. This is what they say in the Philippines. Listen, sir, I've been driving this road for like 15 years. And every 7 months, 6 to 7 months, the opposite side of the road, or the parallel side of the road, is under construction. He says, do you know why? I said, I'm kind of getting a picture here. And he said, well, obviously because, the grift that's going on. And so they're so good that after a while, he noticed that exactly at 6 months, they were able to switch the road. So they would finish a road, right? And then they would start repaving the other side of the road, while that side that they had repaved at 6 months, by the time they finished that one huge stretch of the road, would degrade. Yeah. And they had become expert at mixing the asphalt so that it degraded within 6 months.
Yeah, right? Planned obsolescence.
Yeah. And so how could they get away with this? And then what were the effects of? Because if you need to go to work on that stretch of the highway, you're losing 2 hours of your life every which way you're coming, right? So another thing in the Philippines is security, right? It's just unsafe because of the amount of population and the lack of reliable police force and so on and so forth. Although with President Duterte in the last few years, maybe you could counter that. But imagine that you were an e-commerce company. Okay, number one is you had to get through 4 hours of gridlock. Okay, and that cell phone that motorcyclist is taking, because it's the only way to use go through this traffic is by a motorcycle, is worth 3 times this guy's monthly wage. Right. Mm-hmm. And this guy has a chance to get robbed. I mean, so something simple that in the United States doing e-commerce would be extremely difficult in a country like the Philippines or Indonesia, maybe not for security reasons, but just for traffic jam reasons and logistics reasons, especially even finding where these addresses are. Then if you're not an established address, right, then the difficulty there is very difficult. And so what I realized as well is that if you can look at the public infrastructure and you could really say that, okay, garbage is not picked up regularly, drinking water is not accessible all the time, there are, 10 brownouts in this region, right? Then you could create data points that actually show where the corruption is. And then over a period of time, you'd have a year's worth of data. Then you'd have this kind of base level of data, and then it would be public, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where the social proof of work comes in, is that we, devise these surveys, which are purely socioeconomic surveys. They have nothing to do really with who's corrupt or who's bad or whatever. You don't need to do that, right? You can just look at the results. What are the fruits of the tree here, right? And the fruits are all rotten, right? And then how many times is garbage picked up in your principality, right? How expensive is your internet? How expensive is your electricity? How reliable is your electricity? And the other thing, though, too, is that
just some basic quality of life issues, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But for us in a developed country, we take those for granted. Of course, there's maybe one brownout a year because there was a massive storm or a heat wave, right? Yeah. But not randomly, whatever. And then the response from either these private institutions that are supported by whichever corrupt regime there are is oh well, it was better than last year. but there's no data. And I realized all this, and I'm not, it's a kind of funny thing is like the criticism that I have for the UN or the World Bank isn't that they're not doing good. It's that they don't understand how bad the situation really is, right? And being an executive from like Asia, right? I'm not proud of this, but I know how bad things are. Yeah. I've actually seen it. It's like kind of like theological aside, like when Adam and Eve eat the tree of knowledge, right? You got to know what's good to know what's bad, and what's bad to know what's good.
You have to have had a little bit of experience there to understand, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's just kind of superficial, kind of like let's kind of do good and give money, and not realize that 90% of this money is being siphoned off by those who are distributing it.
So this is 2,000 shoes, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So basically, as they do these surveys, we need to incentivize them. We incentivize them with the ARCC. So what we're hoping for is that if ARCC were to assist in the social transparency of a country, right? Then it would have utility in that way. And I know it's a very abstract utility, right? But in the meantime, the money that we raise for the reserve, right, by the purchase, 90% of it just goes directly to the reserve. Right. Okay. So right now we have 2.7 million algos, and we have 60 million YLDY, which depending on whatever works out to about 5-6 million. And then we have X amount of investments that myself and my co-founder have made to support ARCC and the reserves. And then we don't count that as external funding. I mean, we self-funded it. And any investment takes like 5 to 7 years to really manage out. But we wanted to, obviously put our money where our mouth is and to do it. Now, this may not be the most decentralized thing out there, but I think, in Southeast Asia or these developing countries, they're not concerned about the DAO, and they're not concerned about like the middleman, whatever. They're just concerned about like actually living.
Quality of life.
Yeah.